Hello everyone. This week we are going to discuss the rules versus discretion discussion in the effectiveness of monetary policy, which is related with the course notes we hand out this week for you. Let's begin with what we mean by this discussion: rules versus discretion. The economic policy objectives of all economists are similar, but there are different views among economists on how to pursue policies for these objectives. Advocates of discretionary monetary policy, we mean supporters of activist policy, suggest that the self-correcting mechanism of the economy through wage and price adjustment works very slowly. Therefore, according to those economists, whenever unemployment occurs, government has to follow an active, accommodating, and discretionary policy to eliminate it. Those who advocate that monetary policy should be carried out under a certain rule, and economists who advocate non-activist policy briefly believe that the performance of the economy will improve if the government avoids implementing an active, accommodating policy to eliminate unemployment. While examining the activist-non-activist policy debate, we will consider the situation of the policy to be followed if the economy faces a high unemployment problem. Suppose that economic policy makers are faced with an economy shown in the figure like that. This economy reaches equilibrium at point 0A at the beginning. The quantity of output realized at point 0A is lower than the natural output level, and thus there is a high unemployment in the economy. In this case, decision makers have two different options. If decision makers are not activists and do nothing, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right and over time and pull the economy from point 0A to point 0. Full employment is restored at the newly reached 0 point. An alternative to this policy is the accommodating activist policy. According to this approach, expansionary policies such as increasing money supply, increasing public spending, or reducing taxes should be followed. Within the framework of these policies, it's possible to eliminate high unemployment by shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right until it reaches AD1 position. If decision makers can shift the aggregate demand curve to AD1 simultaneously, the economy will shift to point 1 and full employment will be restored. However, there are several types of lags that prevent moving to this point immediately. The data lag is the time period until decision makers get the data that expresses what is happening in the economy. For example, the correct GDP figure on a quarterly basis can only be obtained a few months after the end of the quarter. For example, in our country, these statistics are published by the Turkish Statistics Institute with the 3-month lag. Recognition lag is the period until the data obtained is fully understood by the decision makers in terms of the future course of the economy. For example, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the organization that officially detects the business cycle periods in the United States, does not publicly declare that the recession begins unless it is 6 months after it has determined the recession period has begun. The regulation lag refers to the time that passes the legal regulations that need to be made in order to follow a certain policy. There is no regulation lag for many monetary policy measures such as open market operations. However, this period is extremely important in terms of fiscal policy measures. For example, it may take 3 months to 1 year due to bureaucratic obstacles in order to achieve a legal regulation that requires a change in taxes or public expenditures. The implementation lag is the time that decision makers decide to follow a new policy until they change the policy tool. Implementation lag is an insignificant one, especially for conducting open market transactions. Because the unit that decides on open market transactions in the central bank can buy or sell treasury bills immediately after the decision of this transaction. On the other hand, it may take time to execute decisions on fiscal policy. For example, it may take time to change the spending habits of public agencies and to prepare tax returns. The effectiveness lag refers to the time it takes to show the effect of the policy pursued on the economy. An important prediction of the monetarist view is that the lag in effectiveness of change in money supply is long and variable from several months to several years. According to Keynesian economists, fiscal policy is subject to a shorter period of effectiveness lag than monetary policy. About 1 year is enough for fiscal policy to show its full impact on the economy. Up to now, we have analyzed the factors that influence decision makers' decisions to pursue an activist or non-activist policy. Let's analyze when these policies are preferable. Activist economists, we mean Keynesians, admit that the adjustment process of wages and prices is extremely slow. According to these economists, the cost of non-activist policy will be high, as the slow motion of the economy to return to full employment will result in massive production losses. In other words, since the return of the aggregate supply curve to its original position is possible only in the long run, intervention in the economy with economic policies will reduce the cost. The mentioned economic policy proposal can be summed up with the famous phrase of Keynes: "We are all dead in the long run." Although the lags discussed above indicate that it will take 1 or 2 years until the aggregate demand curve reaches AD1, the aggregate supply curve shifts to a small extent to the right. In this case, according to figure, the most suitable policy to move the economy from 0A to point 1 is activist policy. The non-activist economists, we mean monetarists, recognize that the adjustment process of wages and prices is faster than activists suggest. According to these economists, since production will return to a natural level, non-activist policy will bring a lower cost to the economy. Economists who advocate non-activist policy argue that an activist accommodating policy in the form of shifting the aggregate demand curve to the AD1 position would bring a higher cost to the economy by increasing the volatility in prices and output. The reason for such a volatility is that the time until the aggregate demand curve reaches AD1 position is long, whereas wages and prices adjust much faster. Therefore, before the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right and become AS1. The economy will shift from point 0A to point 0 and will return to the natural production level. After the AS1 curve has completed the adjustment, the aggregate demand curve will become AD1 and the economy will shift to the point 1A where the AD1 and AS1 curves intersect. Since the production realized at this point is above the natural production level, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and return to AS0 position, and then the output will return to the natural level. Activist policy ultimately moves to the economy to point 1 targeted by decision makers, but causes the ranking of a 0A, 0, 1A, and 1 equilibrium points to emerge. Thus, the output level and prices follow highly volatile course. For example, output diverges from the targeted YN level to leap to Y1A. Prices drop from P0A to P0, then to P1A, and finally to P1. Since volatility is not a desirable event, decision makers should follow a non-activist policy that puts the economy at 0 and leaves it there. In the studies analyzing the inflationary processes that have taken place since 1970s, it has been revealed that the expectations regarding the policy to be followed can be an important factor in this process. If we accept that the expectations regarding the policy to be followed are effective in determining the weights, we get another reason for why the non-activist policy should be followed. Does the probability that the expectations regarding the policies to be followed have an impact on the weight setting process require non-activist policy monitoring? According to activist policy supporters, an activist policy that will be followed due to the slow adjustment of weights and prices will lead the economy to the full employment equilibrium at point 1. According to these economists, the time required for the economy to reach this point is much shorter than the time it takes for the economy to shift 0A point to 0 point by following a non-activist policy. However, activist policy supporters ignore two possibilities. One, the possibility that expectations about policy to be followed will be effective in the wage setting process. And two, since aggregate supply curve has already shifted from AS1 to AS0 due to wage increase or negative supply shock, the possibility that the economy had initially shifted from point 0 to point 0A. Given these possibilities, the following question regarding the activist policy needs to be answered. Will the aggregate supply curve continue to shift to the left after the economy reaches point 1? In other words, will cost-push inflation arise? If the expectations regarding the policy to be followed are important, the answer to these questions will be yes. According to our cost-push inflation analysis in the previous lecture, if workers know that the policy to be followed in the future will be an accommodating one, they will continue to increase their wages and thus cause the aggregate supply curve shift to the left. Ultimately, decision makers will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right to eliminate the resulting unemployment, thereby accommodating to cost increases. Accordingly, an accommodating activist policy with the goal of achieving high employment has the disadvantage or hidden cost of causing inflation. The result can be summarized as, although expansionary monetary policies due to activist or discretionary policies seem attractive in the short term, they cause problems in the long term. This result is called as the time inconsistency problem. The reason for the time inconsistency problem caused by activist policies is that the behavior of the economic agents is affected by the expectations regarding the future decisions of monetary authorities. Under this assumption that the expectations of economic units remain constant, economic policymakers think that they can accelerate the increase in output and lower unemployment by following a more expansionary monetary policy than expected. Therefore, there is always a tendency for decision makers to pursue this type of over-expansionary monetary policy. However, as decisions on prices and wages reflect expectations, economic agents change their expectations not only on inflation but also on wages and prices. Therefore, on average, expansionary policies with a larger size than expected do not have an impact on output but accelerate inflation. Even if the central bank thinks its activities are correct, it can turn to such expansionary policies and face undesirable problems in the long run. On the other hand, even if the central bank is aware of the problem of time inconsistency, it may be difficult to avoid this problem due to political pressures on the central bank to follow expansionary policies. The main advantage of a non-accommodating or non-activist policy in which the decision makers do not attempt to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right in the face of the increase in wages is that it prevents inflation. If a non-accommodative, non-activist policy is followed, the result of the wage increase is that the unemployment rate is higher than the natural unemployment rate for some time. However, at the end, production and prices will return to starting levels before the increase of wages. The main criticism toward non-activist policy is that when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, the economy will face unemployment for a long time. However, in such a situation, if the workers knew that the policy to be followed will not be accommodating, they will not demand higher wages, because the wage increases will cause unemployment to continue for a long time. In addition to preventing inflation, a non-accommodating policy is another advantage that it prevents aggregate supply curve to shift left. As a result, if the expectations of the workers about whether public authority is following an accommodating or a non-accommodating policy are important for the wage-setting process, the rationale for a non-activist policy monitoring is stronger. Are the expectations important during the determination of wages? The answer to this question is key in deciding which of the activist or non-activist policies to choose. Therefore, the answer to the question mentioned is one of the main issues in economic research conducted today. However, the results obtained from these studies are not yet certain. Therefore, we can investigate whether policy expectations on other issues affect people's behavior. The information we will obtain will help us to decide whether the expectations are effective in the wage-setting process. A good bargainer knows that he will make a more profitable shopping if he convinces the counterpart that he will not accept, will not accommodate the offer to be made. For example, if you are bargaining on a price with a car dealer, you have to convince the seller that you can easily go to the auto gallery across the street to make a profitable purchase. The same principle applies to the execution of foreign policy. It's your advantage to convince the opponent that you are going to go to war, that is, you will not accommodate, if your requests are not accepted. If your opponent thinks that you will accommodate, he will definitely exploit you. According to these examples, the expectations about the policy to be followed affect the behavior of people. Therefore, it's quite logical that the expectations about whether the policy is an accommodating or non-accommodating are important in the weight-setting process. The new classical macroeconomic view, which constitutes a new development in monetary theory, states that the expectations regarding the policy to be followed are an important factor in the determination of weights and the shifting the aggregate supply curve. If you remember, according to the rational expectations theory, all available information is used to form expectations, including expectations for the policy to be followed. It's possible to draw the following conclusions from the reviews we conducted on the above explanations. Economists who advocate activist policy in fact support a discretionary policy in order to eliminate it whenever excessive unemployment occurs. The reason for such a conclusion is that, according to these economists, the adjustment process of prices and wages is extremely slow and not affected by expectations. According to economists who support a non-activist policy, discretionary policies to eliminate excess unemployment will backfire. The reason for this conclusion is that, according to these economists, the adjustment process of wages and prices is fast and the expectations regarding the policy to be followed are effective in the wage-setting process. Accordingly, economists who support non-activist policy advocate applying a policy rule in such a way that the aggregate demand curve does not diverge from the growth trend of the natural output level. Monetarist economists advocate a rule-based monetary policy in which the central bank maintains a constant increase in money supply. This monetarist rule is called the fixed monetary growth rule. As it can be understood from our analysis above, in order for a non-accommodating policy to be successful, this policy must be credible. The public should believe that decision makers are decisive and will avoid causing cost-push inflation by shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right to eliminate unemployment. In other words, those who make economic policy decisions should have credibility that they are fighting against inflation in the eyes of the society. Otherwise, workers will raise wages further, which will lead to unemployment or inflation or both by shifting the aggregate supply curve to the left after the economy reaches full employment. However, a credible, non-accommodating policy will eliminate the possibility of continued wage increases, thereby preventing inflation and an increase in unemployment. Connecting monetary policy to a rule is also seen as a solution to the problem of credibility. Naturally, the problem here is what the rule for the monetary policies to follow will be. Now, this will end our discussions about rules versus discretion in implementing the monetary policy. You will find a large information in your course notes. Please read them.